Welcome friends and acquaintances. We have no camera for today because you have been seeing too much of me lately. I wouldn't want you to fall in love with me because, it wouldn't work out between us. However, on this Saturday we have yet another round, as usual, welcome round of balance tuning for quite a few specs. Now, by my calculations, we are looking at 5 specs being buffed and 3 specs being nerfed, including some of the long time missing specs which have not received changes in quite a while. So let's start with the first spec, which has received some changes for today, which is Death Knight, and in this case we are talking about Unholy Death Knight. So Death Knight is receiving a buff in damage to a bunch of their current talents or abilities, like Reaping, Festering Wound, Scourge Strike, or its upgraded version Glowing Shadows, and Death Coil. Now, this is not particularly relevant to the single target version of DK, to the new empowering your gargoyle version of Unholy, which will be doing the majority of its damage with their pets. So buffing Reaping, Festering Wounds, Scourge Strike and Death Coil is not really going to amount to too much in that build. It's more a relevant buff when it comes to AoE. In AoE you will be using, besides Epidemic, you will also be using Festering Wound and Glowing Shadows, so this one can be closer to a 3 to 4% damage increase in AoE for Death Knight. What is perhaps a bit more relevant is the nerf to the damage of your Gargoyle. The Gargoyle strike damage is reduced by 8%. This is, slightly an offset from the previous buff that your Gargoyle received a couple of weeks ago. Because Death Knights were getting so much haste, the Gargoyle was basically getting faster than 1 second cast ability, and it was too fast for him to cast it that often. So Blizzard made the cast time longer so that it doesn't clip anymore, to get in return 25% more damage. This has proven quite big right now, so Blizzard is reining in the damage of Gargoyle Strike by just a bit. Overall, it should be still a damage increase in AoE, perhaps slightly less in single target, considering the buffed version of Gargoyle Strike in the PTR. There is also a slight buff to your tier set after your tier set was nerfed the last time, getting you 1 stack of your buff every time you consume Sudden Doom instead of 2 stacks. Now the buff is that the duration of the buff goes from 20 to 25 seconds. Which is pretty good because your Gargoyle does last for 25 seconds. So now your tier set will have the same duration of the summoning of your Gargoyle, and almost cover the full 30-second duration of your Army of the Dead. So it's still overall a net positive change for Unholy Death Knight, which was not looking, as we checked the melee DPS a few days ago, it wasn't looking exceptional. It was looking much better in the raid compared to Mythic Plus. This change is still overall positive for Death Knight. Then we go on to the nerfed part of the changes, which is to Balance Druid. Balance Druid gets a reduced damage to Starfire beyond 8 targets, so it's no longer gonna do the same splash damage like it does now, and also Starfall damage has been reduced by 5%. The only slight positive, even though it's quite hard to understand from the text, full moons generated by Orbit Breaker now generate 80% astral power in addition to its current effect. The TLDR is that when you proc Orbit Breaker and you get a full moon, you get 10 more astral power than before. That's basically what this means. Now remember that Druid is also one of the 2 specs which is receiving a rework. The Shadow Priest is receiving the big one, and Balance Druid is receiving the tiny one for 10.1. So they do have quite a few more things to look at before the next patch goes live. But in this case, for these specific changes, these are nerfs for Balance Druid, and specifically, of course, to the AoE of Balance Druid. As we see right now in Mythic Plus, the strongest of the casters in Mythic Plus are Balance and Shadow. So Balance is being hit in the AoE portion of their kit right now. Then we have a trio. We have a trio of buffs, something that the player base has pointed out quite a bit, and I did actually too a few days ago when I was mentioning the lack of changes, surprisingly, the lack of changes to mages. Mages are usually quite well loved by Blizzard when it comes to buffing them, yet it had been quite a while since we saw some significant changes to the mage specs. Now, In this round of tuning, we do see large set of buffs to the mage specs, but we have to start with the more disappointing set of buffs because we are starting with Frost Mage. So Frost Mage does get 2 buffs to 2 of their abilities, decent to good value in AoE because Frozen Orb and Blizzard are buffed by 8 and 12%, so those are still valuable when you AoE. You also get Brain Freeze, causing your Flurry to deal more damage, from 50 to 65% additional damage, and also a buff to your tier set. Now the Flurry and Ice Lance damage is increased by 20% instead of 15% with your 2-piece set bonus. So these are buffs you pretty much are going to benefit from all the time. In particular, the first couple in AoE, and then the buffs to Flurry and to Ice Lance as well in single target specifically. So those are fine, but not major, 5-ish% damage in AoE for Frost Mage, for example. What is a bit more sad for Frost is that 2 of the other buffs for the spec are to Glacial Assault and Comet Storm. 20% more damage to Glacial Assault and 10% more damage to Comet Storm. I'm saying sad because at the moment these are talents Frost Mages are not using, they're not playing with them, so these talents, provided Frost Mages will continue to not take these abilities, will essentially go nowhere. They will be wasted buffs because the abilities will not be used by Frost Mage. Blizzard is continuing to buff Ice Lance more and more and more. They even changed the tier set to buff Ice Lance when it previously was buffing Frostbolt. This is in an attempt, as we mentioned before, an attempt to kill the MILF build of Frost. The minimum Ice Lance Frost build, the build where basically, especially in single target, you kind of start ignoring, you kind of start casting the absolute minimum amount of Ice Lances and just keep spamming your Frostbolt. So now, with this yet another round of changes, while being the smallest amount of changes of the Mage specs, it is still trying to veer Frost to play more around Ice Lance again. Then we have Arcane. For Arcane, it's much more straightforward. Both of your tier set bonuses are flat out buffed. The spell damage increase from Arcane Surge goes from 5 to 10%, and the duration of this buff goes from 12 to 18 seconds, so basically buffed by a significant amount, 100% buff to the 2-piece and 50% buff to the 4-piece, so it's major. Also, pretty much all of your most used abilities in both AoE and single target generally are buffed. Arcane Barrage, Arcane Missiles, and Arcane Blast are all buffed in damage, and then Radiant Spark and Touch of the Magi are buffed in duration. They now last 2 extra seconds. This damage duration is actually quite good for quality of life. It's very good because with the 2 extra seconds now you are no longer nearly as tight with your window, with your 10-second window of your Radiant Spark or your Touch of the Magi, for example. Now you can use those couple of extra seconds of your Radiant Spark to use some movement abilities, some defensives, some repositioning, etc., without losing too much DPS. That's sort of the logic behind increasing slightly the duration of these 2 abilities for Arcane Mage. Overall, including the changes to your tier set testable on the PTR, this should be closer to a 7 to 8% damage increase already. So it's a significant improvement to Arcane Mage, which is still lower than the bigger of the significant improvements, which is to Fire. Because Fire, much like Arcane, also gets buffs to all of their abilities that they use normally, except for one, which is Phoenix Flames. All the others, Scorch, Fireball, Fire Blast, and Pyroblast, are all buffed in damage. Also, you get more buffs to your scaling, in this case to your crit. Improved Combustion now grants you more mastery based on your crit, 75% more mastery based on your crit instead of 50%, and then improved Scorch duration is now 12 seconds long instead of 8 seconds long This is on a similar level to the extra duration of the Arcane change, is to give you more room to be able to play, to be able to have time to do other things other than pressing Scorch. Now the 12-second window should allow you to be able to play with improved Scorch. However, many mages, in particular fire mages, even though this buff is quite big, it's a 10+% damage increase for fire, would still likely be complaining about the mechanics, about how the spec is working, particularly around Sun King's Blessings. Fire mages have not been too happy playing around with this ability. The fact that when it procs, you have a 15-second window to get the total 6-second casts of your Rune of Power, your hard cast Pyroblast, regardless of the mechanics. You know, if you have some mechanics where you have to move, you have to group, you have to spread, and you have to stack, and you somehow can't make it to hard cast your Pyroblast, you have now just committed DPS suicide. You have lost your Rune of Power on the ground, you have lost your Sun King's Blessing buff, you have delayed your next Sun King Blessing proc, and you have also delayed your next combustion. That's very painful, it's very damaging to fire, to play around such a clunky hard cast mechanic of Pyroblast, so that's been the main issue with fire. Blizzard clearly didn't have enough time, I guess, in this patch to fix the mechanics of the spec, so they just flat out buffed. They just boosted all of the damage of the abilities, but I fear the spec will continue to be quite clunky to play in 10.1, even though now it's gonna be definitely more powerful. We then move to a couple of nerfs though. We have a couple of nerfs down the priest line. The first in line is Holy Priest. Dazzling Light's healing from Divine Image has been gutted by a whole whooping 50%. This build was the one played on the PTR as opposed to the current build you are playing right now as a Holy Priest, because your Divine Image was getting beefed up quite a bit, because you were getting quite a lot of HPS in the raid. Holy Priest was looking quite good in the raid in terms of sheer HPS. Now this nerf is gonna be quite more significant. It might bring you back to no longer take Divine Image as a talent after this nerf. Empower Renew has been buffed significantly to instantly heal your target for 40% of its total periodic effect instead of 10%, but that's because Empowered Renew now only triggers from your own Renew casts, so not from the free renews you can get off in multiple ways from your talents, just from your own. So overall, it has been made weaker compared to the current version of Holy Priest. The only slight buff is the faster ramp up of the stacks of Healing Chorus compared to now, but it's not nearly as important as the other couple of nerfs. This should be roughly 5% or a little bit more less healing for Holy Priest. As I said, all things considered, Holy Priest right now and in the PTR was looking quite high on their HPS power, in particular in the raid. Unfortunately, this nerf trying to rein in the HPS power of the priest in the raid will also hurt them in Mythic Plus, because Divine Image was quite strong in Mythic Plus and now it will be made significantly weaker in that activity as well. As I said, there were two specs down on Priest getting nerfed, the other one is Shadow. Now, Psychic Link does less splash damage. It's 30% of the damage of your abilities instead of 40% getting splashed around. Now, you might know already, Shadow Priest is the S tier spec in Mythic Plus. They do have one of the strongest AoE damage, sustained AoE damage in the game. In the PTR it was just more of the same. Even with the whole rework of Shadow Priest, they were still very strong, so Blizzard is trying to lessen this power in 10.1. In return, they are buffing Mastermind to get you more critical strike damage of your abilities, to give more value, to give more scaling to your critical strike stat. Not nearly as important at the moment, since you are not, as a Shadow Priest, taking Mastermind right now, or in your 10.1 rework, Mastermind wasn't being taken, so for now, the general result of the Shadow Priest changes is that it's a nerf in AoE. to your damage of Psychic Link. The last spec to be changed, it's also good news because it's a buff, and it's also better news because it was one of the specs not really changed recently. This one is to Elemental. It starts with a slight nerf to the lava surges triggered by Primordial Surge, increasing the damage of your next lava burst by much less, from 25 to 15%, but besides that, it's a whole bunch of damage buffs. Lava Burst now does 12% more damage, Elemental Blast, Earth Shock and Lightning Bolt all do 6% more damage. This is all quite significant. We live in this kind of bizarro world where Shaman started Dragonflight going down the right side of their tree, being all about fire version, fire damage build, and now, especially on the PTR, Elemental is sort of moving the other way around. Now they have turned into a blue side, they have turned into a lightning damage build. Yes, it seems quite depressing, right? You're basically pressing 2 buttons most of the time, but these buffs are also going to improve that type of build with Lightning Bolt and with Elemental Blast getting their damage increased. And still, if you want to go back to your right side build, to your Lava Burst fire damage build, you still have your Lava Burst buffed by 12% in damage. It was one of the last specs of ranged being left a little bit more behind. We had 2 of the Warlock specs looking quite good on the PTR with Demo and Affliction. We also had Shadow Priest, we had Balance Druid looking good, Devastation Evoker was looking good, Beast Mastery Hunter was still doing fine, so more or less the only one left behind were the mages and the Elemental Shaman. And now these specs have all received some good amount of buffs in this last round of tuning. So it's good to know that with about 10 to 12 days left to the release, or I should say the end of this season, entering the off-season before May the 9th, when Season 2 will begin, we have gotten yet another round of balance tuning for the next patch. So I will leave you now with your own considerations about these buffs or nerfs, as well as your own considerations about complaining for some specs still missing from changes, like for example, one random name, Holy Paladin, is still one of the specs really not being given any attention from the tuning from Blizzard. That's quite worrying, but enough with the complaints. We were not here for that for today. So with this out of the way, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support, of course, with completely free ways. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. And also, you can follow me over on Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these social unnecessarities out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't like this. I don't like waking up in the morning, especially when it's starting to get more sunny. I shouldn't be able to wake up at 10 a.m. My God.